My introduction to Russ was through Salem City Club, and many of you are a part of that group too. And he has enlightened me in all kinds of ways with explaining economic concepts that have come up through City Club. He's a great educator, and I've kind of come to that conclusion about the Willamette Economics Department because Tom over here was so clear in your presentation, you and Mark. I mean, we're getting educated, and that's why we're here, right? Okay, a little bit about Russ, and there was something on our webpage, and some of this might be a duplication, but he grew up. He's truly an Oregonian. He grew up in the Hood River Valley, graduated from Willamette in 1960. From there, he went on to get a PhD in economics from Claremont Graduate School, and he's taught full-time in 3 different institutions: Cal State Fullerton, Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC, and then for 33 years here at Willamette. He was also one of the original planners for the Atkinson Business School and has taught there. So there are lots of awards that he's gotten, and I actually Googled you, and there was a whole page of Russ Beaton, writing this, and but we'll just go for the short version. He was a finalist for university-wide teaching awards at all 3 of the schools that I mentioned above. He was also the first faculty mentor. This was something that was started in 1990 for consultation in promoting university-wide teaching pedagogy, and he was elected by his faculty peers to serve as their first mentor. That's always nice to be recognized by your peers. He's taught 22 different courses, and I was so surprised to look at the names of some of them, but they cover the whole gamut of what's out there. Some of them urban land economics, history of economic thought, finance, environmental economics, energy economics, mathematical economics, and today he's going to be talking about wealth inequity. He's written 3 books, co-authored, and is working on a 4th with his brother, who also is a Willamette graduate. And that book is Localism, the Economics of Peace. So, economics of peace, another form of economics. He played a key role in establishing Oregon's requirement for urban growth boundaries, and published several urban growth boundary studies, including the first one in the country. He's also worked across the street with the legislature and all kinds of efforts. So we are in revered company here, and we are so happy that you could come and be with us. And this is not his first time, but let's give him a nice ICL welcome.
Well, usually you don't hear that kind of stuff till the memorial service for someone. While you mentioned my old friend Tom and Priscilla here, we met at Claremont Graduate School, and so we've known each other a long time, and I think, Tom, at least 2 of the 3 universities that Gretchen mentioned, we've taught at together, so we go back a long ways. And also, while I'm into acknowledging economists, Raj Sharak, there she is, out there, when she was an economist at Department of Land Conservation and Development, we had a lot to do with each other back then, and welcome to you as well. Now, the next challenge, of course, is how to work the technology. And here's where most of us start hoping our grandkids show up. A brief look at inequality for the U.S. Well, big topic. I'm going to give you kind of a statistical rundown to start with. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. I know we're all not as young as we used to be, and it's after lunch, so we have to worry about staying awake. The first chart I have for you, when I do a presentation, I work with the assumption that it should get more interesting as it moves along. See? And I should have no trouble at all meeting that goal, because this is a very dull chart. And before I go on to any that are more interesting, I will try to explain what this does, because ironically enough, its point is dullness. There are 6 lines on here, and they are the bottom quintile of the income distribution, the second, third, fourth, and fifth. In other words, the lowest one will be the lowest 20% of the income distribution, and the second one, the purple one, is the top 20% of the income distribution. And then just for effect, I included on it the top one, which is the top 5%. So that top line only talks about 5%. All the others are 20% percentiles. And the reason this is dull, and it's in here, is that this shows the income growth by year for 1970 to 1975. And it shows that all percentiles, if you will, were gaining at about the same rate. Nobody was outpacing one or another. Now, this chart says 1970 to 75. Subsequent charts are going to show 70 to 80, 70 to 85, and so on, so that it all remains based at 1970. All right, so let's move along here. From 75 to 80, you can see it didn't change much more. Let's move on through. Notice that the right end is starting to move up. Now, I want to make sure that you understand the impact that what this is really saying. It compares how people at different income levels are progressing or not in their income gain over time. So what you would hope, if you're rooting for more income equality, is that these lines stay all about at the same slope. The slope is more important really than the height. Moving along, we get finally to 1990. Now this is the end of the Reagan era. I'm going to try to resist picking on Reagan here, but it'll be tough. So the next 5 years, and this gets us into the Clinton era, and the Clinton, Reagan, these are just time periods, right? No accusation implied. Now notice that, and I think this works. Notice that little quirk right there where the upper level stops rising at quite as rapid a rate. That's about 1990. That is probably the recession that lost George Bush the election to Bill Clinton. Remember, it's the economy, stupid. But Clinton ran on that. And we were in a little recession, nothing like what was to come later. Let's move along. Yeah. Oh. It started. Now, I resisted putting the top 1% on here. Remember, the red curve, the top one, is the top 5%. If you'd broken it down more fully, the 1% curve would be way up there above. And we'll see some data later that talks about that. Okay, now this takes us to 2000. And this takes us on to 2005. And notice there's a there's a little dip up there again, and I'll talk about these a little bit later. Right there, that's basically the collapse of the high-tech boom in the stock market, and shortly after 2000. A brief story. I was teaching at the Atkinson School at that point in time, and it required a term project of some graduate student, and this fellow wasn't a young kid, he was 40 or more, came to me and said, I'd like to do a simulation of whether the stock market's going to hold up. This was in 2000, and the Dow Jones was roaring ahead. And he came in December, that was the fall class, and gave his final report. And what he had done is simulated the amount of demand in the economy for the types of goods that were represented in the high-flying computer.com stocks at that time. And his conclusion that he kind of tossed off, he said, in short, if these things are all to fulfill their promise, in other words, if the high-flyingness of these stock issues right now was to be real and fulfilled, we would have to have 8 times the demand for certain goods that there is in the whole economy. He says, this baby's going to crash. Well, it crashed about a month later. You know, I wish I'd sold short on his advice. So that little dip was serious. I'd like to ascribe it to George Bush II, but frankly, he hadn't been in office long enough to cause that yet. He causes it later. Okay, this takes us to 2010, and so right into the Great Recession, the housing bubble collapse and all that. So you can see again the poor top people at the 5% are struggling then. Of course, you look down below, you know, everyone else has never done very well over the whole period of time, right? Okay, this brings us to 2014. A strong resumption of the growth of at least of the top 5%. And finally today, and that's as late as the data went on this set, about 2015 or so, 2016. So now if we go back and try to ascribe this process to Reagan or the Reagan era, you might say, oh yeah, it started there. But let's be clear, the 1990s didn't slow down at all. The recollection, and I can say a lot more about this when we get into question and answer later, the recollection of us looking back is, gee, the 90s were a nice, good economic time. And it was in terms of aggregate employment, and of course probably more because we had a divided Congress with the presidency. It was more that Clinton and the Republicans didn't get together that we balanced the budget for the last time, okay, and not since. But the growth of the gain in income didn't slow down at all, and I ascribe that really more to the structure of the global economy than to whoever's in office. So let's go here. Now, I've already talked about the 3 points that I identified on this chart a little bit. Number one was, and you see here, yeah, 1980. Number one was the start of the Reagan era. 2 is pretty much the start of the Clinton era. And then I didn't identify the Clinton era end in there, but then the Great Recession and on about. Other than the little economic wrinkles that I've identified, and of course 2008 was a big wrinkle, it pretty much, the growth of inequality as looked at by these statistics has been pretty much continual. Okay, now let's look at something else. That's pretty much the story, and we'll look at some other data that make it more clear shortly. That's pretty much the story with income growth. This is the wealth picture, if you will. So, inequality these days is usually focused on 2 things. Number 1, failure to gain in your income, and number 2, failure to gain in net worth or or wealth, if you will. Now, this data is split into 5 quintiles. Each one has 2 colored charts. The red chart shows the wealth level in 2000, and the blue one shows the wealth level in 2011. So the difference between the height of those two points within each quintile is pretty much shows you how that income group has fared in terms of getting wealthier, if you will, over their lifespan during that 10-year period, 10 or 11-year period, the first 10 years of this millennium, if you want to make it pretty important. I put the numbers in here, and they slid over a little bit, but that's okay. Notice that the top quintile had its wealth gain at about 11% rate. The second quintile, that is percentile 60 to 80, 9.8%. But then below that, they all lost. They all lost ground. The middle quintile didn't lose much, but the last two, pretty much non-existent. So not only didn't they grow, they didn't have anything to start with, right? Let's look at this one more way. I graphed it. And so if you're in the black, you're gaining. If you're in the red, you're losing. So the wealthier, the higher income groups did relatively well. The middle just sat there, maybe lost a little bit, and you had monumental losses if you're in the lower income, right, in terms of wealth. So we say in terms of net worth, if you will, the wealthier did all right. The poor really struggled at this point. Now, I'll try to relate some of this stuff to what it means with social policy in a few minutes. But you can see from that, just to try to give you the idea of what the graph means, we would be in serious trouble without Social Security, wouldn't we? Because the lower income types have no way of, or at least they haven't displayed any way of gaining their ability to support themselves in later life, during their income earning career. Now, incidentally, notice the little arrow going down. If I had scaled this thing to scale without just kind of cutting that off, I mean, that chart would have had to go clear through the basement, and it would, I tried it on the graphs, and you couldn't even see the other little things there. So anyway, they just dropped, whatever. They had a negative net worth to start of $500 or $600, and a net worth average about minus $10,000. So there were visas that were being used as well. Okay, conclusions to this point. Income gains since 1975 to 80, since that time period, have gone predominantly to the higher earners. And the accumulated wealth patterns are even more extreme. Okay, where do we go from here? Well, I'm gonna create an example for you. We've got a hypothetical country which I call Nolandia, since it doesn't exist. Assume Nolandia, it has a GDP of 1,000 moos. A moo is their currency, that's a monetary unit. It has a population of 100. It has, incidentally, I didn't put this on here, no foreign trade allowed, so it's a closed system. Has to produce everything it consumes as well. And we'll take a look at that later. So obviously, since you have 100 people and 1,000 GDP, you have a per capita income of 10 moos. Now let's be real clear. People, the Nolandians are doing all right at 10 moos a year. They're okay. This isn't a really bad developing country, nor is it a really wealthy country, but just assume that they're doing okay. All right. Now we're going to get into some graphs here. This is a picture of Nolandia and its income distribution. So the blue area is the total income. That's the area that would be 1,000. And since the income distribution is completely equal, It's got a flat line across there, okay? Now, this is the wet dream of a pure communist, shall we say? It's perfect equality, and even us devotees of a more equal capitalistic system, we'd like to say, gosh, is there no room for meritocracy, and aren't you supposed to do better if you have more education or if you're smarter or something like that? So, yeah, let's grant you some degree of inequality is probably not a bad thing, just not as bad as we've got it. Okay. Now, I graph this in a different way, and we're going to use this tool shortly. But if I were drawing what's called a Lorenz curve, a picture of income distribution, it would look like this. The green line is perfect equality. Now, the way you read that, obviously, is 50% of the population along the horizontal axis has 50% of the income, vertical axis. Okay, so if you have inequality, that line will differ from the straight line, as indeed it will. So let's assume, now let's start to build in a little something else. One Nolandian, we will call him Tex, see, for no particular reason, just succeeds in starting a business, and he gets one moo of income from each other Nolandian. Right, he's doing pretty well here. Maybe he invented the iPhone or something like that. We all have to have it. So this gives us Nolandia 2, and the version of the graph with blue on it looks like this. So the yellow is Texas income, and it'll go up. I don't know if it's in scale or not here, but basically he now has 109 moos income, and everyone else has 9. Now so the graph looks like this. The blue plus the yellow still equals 1,000 moos. And most importantly, it gives us a distribution ratio really between the wealthiest and the poorest, and you hear a lot about that kind of number these days, of 12 to 1. Okay? Now, and this is the picture that we would draw of that. And we can say 99% of the people have 89% of the income. And turn that around, 1% therefore has 11, if you do the reverse. It's still a straight line below that point because everyone else still has 9, the same, right? Now let's assume Tex is sort of a hyperactive capitalist, and he really becomes even more successful in his businesses, maybe the Steve Jobs or somebody like that. His businesses are getting 5 moos in sales from each other Nolandian. Now, obviously this could be a group of businesses, whatever, and this leads to what I'll call Nolandia 3. Now here again, can't do the scale because it would go about 200 feet in the air, and so it has a break there. Tex now has 505 moos income, and all others aggregate 495. Distribution ratio, wealthiest to poorest, is now 101 to 1. Sounds bad? Well, we're worse in reality. Let's see what the graph looks like. Well, first of all, here's what's happening. The shaded orange that used to be held by all the Nolandians has now gone to Tex, and that little thin thing on the right, which is 1% of the width, because he's 1% of the population, 1%, 99%. Oh, maybe you've heard that term sometime. Well, we'll get there. And that little yellow sliver has to go high enough to have exactly the same or a little more area than the blue. What's left for the others. Okay, and here's what that picture looks like. 99% have 49.5% of the income. Okay? Now, questions that arise. What are the broad, for a minute here, what are the broad societal, social, and political implications of all this? In other words, here's some data. What does it mean when we start trying to manage our economy in terms of, number one, health care? Let's go back, just for the heck of it, to Nolandia 1, where all people were equal. What's the healthcare debate going to look like? Well, it's probably, one Nolandian will look at another. They're all the same income. Somebody might say, well, I got an idea. How much do we want to spend on healthcare? Maybe 12% of our income. We'll just tax ourselves 12% and we'll call it an insurance policy, and everybody has healthcare from then on. Be a pretty easy agreement to make, wouldn't it? What about, well, let's talk about Nolandia 3. They say, let's have a healthcare system. Tech says, well, I'm fine with mine. Why doesn't everybody just buy their own? Okay? And that's not going to work out that well. So you got a little conflict there. Let's look at Social Security, for instance. Again, Tex is going to say, well, I'm fairly comfortable here. You go ahead and save for your retirement. Or better yet, let's privatize it, see? And that's not going to sit too well with all the rest of them. Well, how about political decisions? One of the 99 Nolandians could say, I've got an idea. Let's finance Social Security with a tax levied on all income over $6. And who does that hit? Well, everyone but Tex earns 5, see? So Tex is going to say, wait a minute, if we did that with that taxation system, I would pay for all your retirement. This is not fair. And if they're smart, they look at him and say, you're not fair. You're the problem here. So here's my point, that all decisions about public policy become worse or harder to the degree that you have inequality in the system. So, and I frankly feel, I'm an economist and I can say everything's economics. Tom and I are used to seeing faculty members all interpret the world, most importantly in terms of their discipline. See, historians will say, unless you know history, you're dead, and biologists say biology is everything. Chemists will say all things are chemical building blocks, and whatever. Well, that's part of our charm in academia. You see, we got to be arrogant about our own field, and then students visit and we treat them as disciples and move on from there. So, but what I was going to say is, I believe the growing inequality we've experienced in the last 30 to 40 years is at the root cause, the main reason for all the political discord that we have now. And that's, I can debate that one a long time, but we'll see. One more thing here. How about production decisions? Here is an element that people don't think much about. But now that Tex, this is Nolandia 3 again, now that Tex is 505 moos of the 1,000, he has half or a little over the purchasing power in the system. Now remember, the system so far is a closed system. And therefore, in order to keep from falling into a complete depression where nothing is purchased, the production in the economy has to be half geared to whatever the heck Tex wants, see? Or it isn't going to sell. Well, frankly, I think that I don't want to get deeply into this. It's a fairly new idea I've had. I'm not sure it makes sense. That the Clinton era, the late 90s, was ostensibly a very healthy time period, but it was a rapid growth in services and fairly low income jobs, services and luxuries, if you will. And the economy stayed healthy because everybody really was working, even though they may have been slightly overspending their incomes. You see, if you're going to stay healthy, superficially, at least at the aggregate level, you look, economists do their thing and look at the economy and say we're reasonably healthy right now. no recession, no unemployment, et cetera, the rapidly growing lower income earners have to be incented to spend all their money, or the economy doesn't go anywhere. I mean, one of the things I remember from that period of time is economists in the U.S. would wring their hands that our national savings rate was very low, 1%, 1.5% sometimes. And there were periods of time when it even got negative, and we'd look at, say, Japan, and their savings rate would be 10 or 12%, something like this. Well, I used to have a cartoon on my door, and it had a beleaguered looking consumer looking very strange, and had economist 1 yelling at him from one side and economist 2 yelling at him from the other. Economist 1 was saying save, economist 2 was saying spend. So, you know, do you save your money and get yourself well off and impoverish the economy because nobody's spending anything, or do you spend it and spend your way into oblivion? Obviously, credit card binge and all that was very that's been widely discussed since then. That does nothing more than induces you to buy something now on next year's income. The farther ahead you look, well, the more you're committing your future income. Okay, let's look at another graph. Boy, there's a nice one. We've been assuming this will get us into the real world now. We've been assuming that our income distribution is shaped like that, with the Nolandian example. In other words, you got one really rich person and a whole bunch of people who are the peasantry. This is sort of a medieval concept, right? But it's really more like that. In other words, there's a range of incomes below the top incomes. And another way, I've already used data of that type. We could look at that in deciles, every 10 percentage points. Or a lot of the data occurs in quintiles, bottom 20%, next 20, etc., etc. And if you want to get more into it further, you can take the top 20%, the top quintile, if you will, and split it down more fully. And there's been a whole lot of that going on in recent years. Most of you are probably aware of that you hear a lot about the top 5%, top 10%, top 1%, and even later, more recently, the top 1/10 of 1%. So the 99th percentile and the 99.9, you know, this kind of stuff. I noticed, I think Money Magazine came out with its annual Who's the Richest yesterday or day before. And Jeff Bezos, I guess, is the winner at something over $110 billion. And we're all supposed to, isn't that wonderful? We can all be that. Oh, forget it. All right. Now, also another tool, this Lorenz curve that I've talked about, this is a more realistic type of Lorenz curve where the yellow line differs from the perfect equality ideal of the green line. And a typical Lorenz curve, here's what it means. That is the difference between vertical distance for any percentile in the income distribution. You do it for the 20th percentile, the 60th, or anywhere you want. The vertical distance between the equality line and wherever that data fall for your system is a measurement of inequality. And the picture is a Lorenz curve. There's a mathematical calculation that ends up a coefficient called the Gini coefficient, and that's basically, that A should be on top of the bar. I don't know what happened to the software, but your software is doing very well, I got to say. And area A over A plus B is a measure of the Gini coefficient. Obviously, if you have perfect inequality, area A doesn't exist, and so it's 0. Value of 0 is perfect equality, and if one person has all the income and nobody else has anything, A over A plus B would be 1. So the higher the coefficient, from 0 to 1, the more inequality you're experiencing. Now, these are alternative Lorenz curves, just so you'll understand where we're going with the U.S. economy. The yellow one was a much more equal economy. The red one would be more unequal. So in the yellow, you'd have maybe Denmark or Norway or someplace like that. And the red one would be El Salvador or Namibia, someplace like that. Who knows? The lesser developed economies, and some of them are catching up with us, are pretty unequal in many ways. Now, some implications here. And a very important point is raised by this one. What about mobility? If you're on here personally at some level, do you have a chance of doing better over the years? And so if you're down at A, at lower income types, you're hoping to get a job, move up to B. Be somewhere in the middle class. You're lower middle class, you're hoping to save a little bit, and you're hoping to move up to C. C, you're doing okay. You're not really rich, but you're doing fine. And then D, you're really up there in the top 1% or whatever. Well, is there mobility here? That's a question that arises. Of course, A may be aspiring up to B. B may be worrying about A, trying to catch up with it, and aspiring up to C. C is worried about everyone below and trying to get to D. And D is saying, what class war? No problem. I'm doing fine. You folks just keep working, and someday you'll be like me. I'll throw in a factoid now and then. A little factoid that concerns me that I heard not long ago. There was a survey taken, and 19% of all Americans think they're in the top 1%. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, especially in the middle and the higher ranges, without being rich, that there isn't a problem. See, and that if the system just holds together, I'll get up there too. See, and it makes the society very unresistant, if you could say, to kinds of systematic changes that may be in order. Okay. So the question that this last chart brings up: do we have upward mobility? In other words, do we have equal opportunity? This graph is actual data from a research center in Minnesota that keeps track of this kind of stuff, and basically what it shows by percentile, so you got the lower income on the left and the higher income on the right, just like the other graphs we've had. It shows what the actual data showed that you experienced in that percentile as to your income growth over a period of time. And they keep this measure every year. This happens to be data from 2016 to 2017. Now notice that if you're up in the upper ranges, you had a gain, or your potential average. If you're in the lower ranges, not only didn't you have a gain, you probably had a loss. So this would argue that the mobility that we would hope exists to lubricate all this doesn't really exist. And so the answer is yes, if we're all well off to start, we have mobility. See? I've done a lot of land use studies, and I make a collection of farmer jokes. And this one reminds me of an old farmer joke where, and this guy may have said this in a legislative testimony, I don't remember. He said, you can make a small fortune in farming if you start with a large fortune. And so if you're well off to start, yeah, you got mobility. If you're not, forget it. Now, what about the fate of the middle class? Heard a lot about that. Well, if you're going back to the Lorenz curve and you want to take a look at the middle class, everything between the two red lines, that is in the middle. And what you want to talk about is upward and lower movement of that middle part of the Lorenz curve. Let's put on, these are actual data points from the U.S. in Lorenz curve. Okay? The bottom 20% have 3.1% of the income. Top 1% has 51% of the income. All right? So those 2 points have to be on our Lorenz curve. And I won't bore you with the mathematics of it, but since everyone above you has more income than you, the curve can't reverse itself in that range. So without fitting data points on there, and it would bore me as well as you, our Lorenz curve looks about like that. Okay? Now that's a heck of a lot more like El Salvador than Denmark, if you want to go back to what we just did. Okay, so our conclusion. If your bottom quintile has very little, your top quintile has a lot, then the middle class mathematically is disappearing. You can't, and that drives that Lorenz curve down. And and if the middle class is mathematically disappearing because of that math, that's my response. Duh, you know, that's a conclusion. You know, by definition, almost mathematically, the middle class is going. Now, this is the last 2 graphs I'm going to show you, and then we can start talking about things, if you will. This is a real mystery what this says, isn't it? Well, you'll notice that a lot of little beads. Each of those beads is the percentile in that area. So, you know, the first percentile, second, third, fourth. So this breaks it down into actual percentile stuff. The gray curve is a curve for one 34-year period in income. And what it shows is how that percentile did for that 34 years. Okay? Now, the gray curve slopes down, which means that for that period of time, the lower income types were gaining at a percentage rate actually faster than the higher income. So you could say the middle class is either being created or augmented, but it looks like a healthy middle class situation. And the red one says the reverse. Well, let's label these. The gray one is average income growth between 1946 and 1980, that magic year again. And that's the post-war period. Now, pretty much all the research on this topic, part of which Paul Krugman got a Nobel Prize for, income inequality type stuff. All the research refers to the end of the end of the World War II, post-war era, as the golden era for American middle class capitalism. Now, what this shows is from 46 to roughly 1980. That looked statistically, that looks true. From 1980 on, the higher income types started doing better. And believe it or not, the right end of the gray curve incorporates all the 1%, 1/10 of 1% type of data. And then and those are broken out in the red ones. So the top 1% is doing great, top 1/10 of 1% doing wonderfully, and the top 100th of 1% doing spectacularly well. Now, another factoid. Okay, I'm just full of factoids. In 1980, roughly, we had $3.5 trillion GDP. Now about 20. At the end of the decade, it had almost exactly doubled to 7 trillion. In that, and therefore we had a gain of $3.5 trillion. It doubled in that 10-year period. In that 10-year period, and it has gotten worse since, 70% of that gain went to the top 1%. When you stop and think about that, that means, okay, the economy may be growing, but the income gains represented by that growth are all concentrated at the top. And this graph is from the work of Thomas Piketty. Some of you may have heard of his monumental study on on capitalism per se, and it has all kinds of stuff that I won't get into. I don't even understand some, but this chart is from his research, and it's very telling, I think. So that's it for my PowerPoint presentation. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if you don't have some questions like, why is this happening and what the hell do we do about it? You know, stuff like that. But let me stop there. I don't know what your format is. You want to take a break or whatever. All right? That's
Russ, I think we'll take questions for 10 minutes and then we'll take a break for 10 minutes maybe.
good. You do it. I can't imagine there being any questions.
Thank you, Russ. When you're talking about income growth, is that actual dollars or buying power, and does it matter?
Well, it's actual dollars, and it's inflation adjusted. So yeah, no, buying power. The buying power is calculated in there with the inflationary adjustment. Go ahead.
Hi,
Oh, hi, Roz.
Roz here. on income, have you seen any studies that talk about source of income, such as wages and salary, and investment income? Because it's my general belief that investment income could be used as a tool to get a lot of the middle class up, to help their income and wealth extend well beyond their salary. Now, it doesn't work for the lowest income people who just do not have a dollar to
Anything to
invest.
save, yeah.
But that's a general belief I have, but I haven't seen any studies that actually show that. What do you think?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, it's a possibility if interest rates are higher than 1%. Some of you, I think, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. How's your 401k doing? No, I haven't seen that, any specific studies. But you made the point yourself. You have to have something to save if you're going to have investment income that means anything. I would think that as you proceed up the income distribution scale, you obviously have more savings than those below you, statistically on the average, and therefore it would be a source of additional income, but it would also be a source of increasing inequality over time. It's a comfortable increase in inequality rather than a really contentious one, but that's what I would say. You mentioned by job type a little bit, and I might get into this later, but another factoid, if you will, that is telling to me is that like 35, 40 years ago, 7% of our workforce was in the finance sector. Now it's 40%. Right. And so, this is very instrumental in my whole theory of what's happening now and what we might do about it. That we have watched manufacturing jobs. This is an oversimplification, but it's pretty much true. We've watched the manufacturing jobs be exported, and we've built in the finance jobs behind it. And the income distribution in the finance sector is a whole lot more unequal than it was in manufacturing. So we've done away with middle class paying jobs, and we've introduced jobs that are very high pay. Think about it for a moment. If all your financial income is at Wall Street, and they're all earning $500,000 a year, well, a lot of them earning more than that, what's that do for your economy overall? And it means that there's a financial center that's very concentrated, and then out in the world, everybody's struggling. Yeah.
I'm taking a different look at it, and it's more of a consumption look. We're indoctrinated to buy, buy, buy.
Sure.
If we had some sort of a reaction by the middle and lower classes saying we have enough junk, what would that do to the economy and the distribution?
Whoa, there's a long one to answer that. we have exported good paying jobs. Okay, now there is a plus side to that we might talk about. And we've bought off the types of people that were put out of those jobs by saying, don't worry, you don't have as much income as you used to have, go shop at Walmart. See? And yeah, you don't have much income, but prices are lower too. And so we have developed a two-class system, whether you're either into the global economy, both what you can buy and how you work, where you work, or you're not. And that has serious social implications for the culture, I think. I remember I was traveling and doing research a little bit in New Zealand. And I'd do research one day and go fishing the next. That was a nice trip. And I remember having people say to me in New Zealand, you know, Mike, you're either into the global economy or not. You know, you can afford to buy the products that they produce because you work there, or you just don't have anything to do with it. Now, here's my final factoid, I hope. A few years ago, the data showed that the Fortune 200 companies had 26% of the world's output running through them. Now that sounds, oh geez, you know, but when you stop and think about it, it's not surprising. Their sales are, you know, in the billions of dollars a piece. Okay, so they produce 26% of the world's goods, let's say. I don't have a problem with that if they employ 26% of the world's workforce. Anybody want to guess what percentage they did employ? One third of 1%. Okay? So the corporation, the global corporation especially, as it has evolved into our biggest mechanism for creating inequality. And I'll pursue that after the break. You'll have to think about that. Another question or two?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Cassia.
The healthcare inequality stuff. I'm wondering whether the disparity in access to healthcare and what it costs overall is a symptom or a cause, potential cause, of this income inequality.
Oh, I think that it is. Yeah, I mean, this gets really, well, you said, I didn't understand the question exactly then. Is that a cause?
Yeah, yes. Is it one of the causes of this income inequality, or is it just a symptom of the fact that we do have income inequality? The fact that we cannot get equal health care across the board for everybody?
Well, I'm absolutely, that's a great question. I'm absolutely certain it's both. That when health care becomes a bargaining point with the corporations, right? We would be so much better off if we had never in our history relied on a business to give you health care, see? Because now as businesses have proceeded, have grown and prospered, so to speak, and now struggling, quite honestly, they're struggling, if they struggle, they're struggling because of inequality, because the inequality is creating a lack of purchasing power out there to buy stuff. So the more unequal they get, the tougher it gets to create sales, because there's no purchasing power out there. You know, Henry Ford understood that. He wanted everybody to be able to afford a Model T. He wanted his workers to be able to afford a Model T. And as Tom knows, you know, somewhere between page 4 and page 6 of the text is the circular flow diagram that shows how businesses, and here businesses on one side and consumer workers on the other, they work for businesses in the input markets, get their money, and then they spend their money in the product market at the top. And it shows how a capitalistic market-based economy sort of is a closed system. We can't bail Nolandia out of its troubles either with foreign trade, I don't think, if we relax that assumption. But healthcare, providing it would clearly be a tremendous boon to more equality. If you think about it, you have two ways of the government redressing inequality. One is to give people direct services that they need that they can't afford to buy, and the other is to give them money that they need so they can buy it. And again, we'll get into a little bit of that. I think I better defer my full answer.
I have one quick
Sure.
question. This is Jim. On that last chart, the one you're showing, it's pretty clear what it's stating. I was just curious, why is it that the 1980 on the first part doesn't correspond with the same level? The y-axis is the...
That's a great question, Jim, and it's because the deflationary indices are different for the two time periods. So one is the equivalent of the other after the inflationary adjustment is calculated in. I had that question myself when I looked at it, and I had to go back to the chart. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Russ, and hey, thank you for all the work you did. You were the only one we could turn to on Senate Bill 100 to get land use going. You're an amazing person. Okay, go ahead. Your Lorenz curve. I always like to look at opposite sides when you're doing it. And so what if Ted decides he's got his Marie Antoinette insurance going in the U.S. and or wherever this place is, and he has diversified across the world, and he hasn't actually been paying taxes on his foreign.
Who again?
Tex.
Oh, Tex. Oh, yeah, good old
Tex has taken his marbles and gone all over the world, and he's not really taxed on a lot of his foreign income. And now your Tex's amount of capital from Noalandia has gone way down. So now, like Venezuela or Cuba, you've got less to go with. So I don't know if you're going to deal with this in your second part or not, but I hear that a lot today on economic arguments that, you know, if you punish it too much, your capital is going to go away, and the only, and you're probably going to disagree with this, but the other side will say the only capital that socialism can use is capital from capitalism.
Wow, where do I start on that one? First of all, if you're dragging this in part, what you're doing is dragging this into the economic development question. In other words, what does these things look like over time, and not only for one country, but for the pattern of all countries. The capital flight. I mean, the phrase. For a developing nation, they want to attract foreign investment, foreign capital. That seems to be the holy grail in the field of economic development. Well, what has worked out in many cases, if not most, is that the entry of a multinational corporation, let's say, into a developing economy, which is supposed to be the way the literature says that developing country gets going. There are all kinds of different theories with economic development. That starts making those people wealthier. The data show that the flight of value from those countries is much greater than the influx of new value. And so economic development, as we have practiced it, is really not doing the job. And that's putting it mildly. Yeah, I think that's close to what you were asking. I'll talk to you on the break, and I'll see if I can do better afterwards.
All right, I think it's time for our break. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I don't know if Sharon's still here, and I didn't talk to her, but I did think of, here she comes. Sharon, one more thing I wanted to say. You're disruptive in class, right? One more thing I should have said to you is that the corporation you refer to are in the process of disjointing themselves really from a strong national identity, so that they're saying, well, look, we're all over the world. We're not just an American corporation anymore. And that tends to exacerbate the problem you raised. So anyway, had some time to think about things, let me just ask for questions. And you will undoubtedly get me into some additional rant. There we go.
Over here.
Right.
I suppose it's obvious, but I'd like to hear it from you how the tax cut and the military spending are going to help this inequality problem we have.
Now, remember, Tom and I are very clear on this. We taught at a liberal arts institution, and therefore we don't have to solve things. We just have to ask the right questions. Okay. Well, let me start by saying the growth of inequality as rapidly as it has been, and I attempted to make this point in a moderate way, it makes the solution of every social or economic problem that we've got more difficult. I think that's the overriding bottom line of inequality. It makes the problems you have to solve harder to solve. And that's what we're experiencing right now with our political disruption by polarization. So, let's just step back kind of antiseptically and say, well, wait a minute, we've got too much inequality premise. What do we need to do? Well, we need to do redistribution. See, that's the ugly R word. Now we've got a cultural bias that says redistribution. My God, we can't do that. From the top, those who now both control the message in that they control the media and the rhetoric, and they control the political process that would have the ability to do something about it. So a redistribution has become the dirty R word, all right? And so we try to call it all kinds of other things, those who propose to do it. But let's look at, and this gets to the answer directly to your question. Suppose we start to redistribute by raising taxes, the obvious way. I don't know how we're going to deal with deficit and lower taxes. And you notice that the recent election has turned the Democrats into the deficit hawks and the Republicans into deficits. They don't matter, whatever. It's all a matter of who controls the government process, and if you control it, you get to direct spending to things you want to spend on, so you don't worry about borrowing money to do that. And anyway, the end of rant there. Corporate tax rates before the recent cut are in the 36% range. The healthy, and I tried to point out that even the discipline of economics looks back on the post-war era as the golden era of the American middle class. In the heart of that, the corporate tax rates were as high as 91% marginal rate, right? They were still 70% into the Reagan era, and they were dropped in there, thanks to our old buddy Bob Packwood, largely. So, if I were to say, well, what's the solution? I would say corporate tax rates raised back to the marginal tax rate, back to 70%. Do you hear that debate going on? You say, oh my God, we've got to save the economy. Let's lower the tax rate from 36 to 20. See? Well, that's a version of Einstein's old premise that you can't solve a problem by the same mindset that created it. See? So the corporations that created the problem, and I'm picking on corporations. I'll have to explain what I mean there. I see the structural problem we've gotten into in the last 30 or 40 years basically being the globalization of capitalism. Okay? So the corporations get bigger and bigger, and as we've just identified, they become not even nationally recognizable things. So that structure is what has allowed the inequality to develop, because we had techs in Nolandia 3 earning 100 times the average citizen. A corporation is nothing more than if I graphed a corporation, I would have drawn a box, just a square up there. It doesn't look like much of a business, does it? Well, inputs go in one side, outputs come out the other side. A corporation is a transforming entity. The money goes in from consumers. It comes out distributed 350 to 1 with the CEO of the 350. Now, we don't worry about that a lot. I mean, I hope you worry about it, but the culture doesn't take that too seriously, because that's only one person at the top of that corporation, right? That is, however, the distributive mechanism in our society, because 95% of all the goods we consume transfer through corporations one way or another. So that's our distributive device. That's what we're using to distribute money, or to distribute income in the system. Now, a capitalistic system, I don't think nothing has ever been invented to rival its ability to create wealth, okay? Because it harnessed self-interest. Adam Smith was right on that. Good old Adam Smith, forever honored memory. But nothing has ever been concocted either that distributes income worse than a corporation. Oh, maybe slavery might do that, but actually the slave owner cared about his slaves. The CEO doesn't really care much about his employees, so there's a difference there. But anyway, if we are going to philosophically stick to our allegiance to a market system, the market, and this is going to sound kind of paradoxical, the market system cannot survive unless we redistribute that wealth much better than we have. Okay? Now so arguing that this system has to be preserved by stopping the redistribution, which is what the tax bill does, see, and saying, oh, we've got to give more incentives to corporations because they employ us all. Well, no, they employ 1/3 of us, of 1% of us all. See, that's the problem. And only the fact that we have a professional class, people like us who don't work for a corporation, work for a university, or doctors and lawyers, we have a professional class that's doing all right. Do we forget that the corporation per se is creating a lot of wealth and a lot of poverty? But capitalism can't survive unless it redistributes, all contra to what it would tell you. Now, we've got that contra in charge right now of our system, and that's probably disastrous. And I don't say that from political ideology. I say it from my analysis of the way the system works right now. You had a hand up back there.
Yeah, this is Don.
Oh, hi, Don.
Progressive income taxation, that notion has not fared very well in recent history. Certainly since the time of Reagan, the top rates have been coming down.
Exactly.
And the recent GOP tax bill, it took another hit. If, however, let's say we had a new election and progressives got elected at all levels, and a progressive president got elected, and marginal or progressive income taxes went into effect with higher rates at the top, obviously. Would this at all even bend the curve as far as wealth distribution in this country?
Wow, Don, that is a great question, and I want to thank you, because that's exactly where my rant was going next, and now I can say it by appearing to respond to the crowd. See? That's great. Let's stop and think about what we would need to do in order to turn this thing around. And in doing that, imagine the kinds of things you hear from a really progressive, go Bernie, this kind of a thing. I'll get to the income thing in a moment, but initially, let's think about minimum wage. You know, one of the elements of that kind of a platform is raise the minimum wage. For the state of where our political discourse is now, we may debate raising it from $7.50 to $7.75 nationally, or something like that. The minimum wage, in order to really be effective, kind of thing I'd like to think about, may need to be about $18 an hour. Because I don't see the minimum wage helping a great deal till it gets that wage earner into the very low reaches, at least, of where they might afford to buy a home. And that ends up $35,000 or up a year. And that's numbers that are a few years old. Well, $18 an hour, rule of thumb is multiply it by 2,000, you've got your annual income, so $18 an hour would be a $36,000 a year income. And if you're going to really do any good to get them off the dole, get them out of even what is officially defined as poverty, has to be more than that. Now, my point is, the range of the discourse in our political culture right now doesn't even get us to, I mean, the points where we need to be are way outside the range of the discussion. Even if a total progressive were to be elected president, along with the Congress, of course, that's the big deal. So it would do good. I mean, I'd support anything that would do that, but the range of discourse is intellectually, it's radically outside the range that our discourse is really in right now. You see, well, it boils back to the question of how much vestige of the system that we have now could we preserve and still get to where we might like to be. I stuck a quote in the book I'm writing last week from William Ophuls. It said, when people approach a problem, the last thing they want to do is to question the methodology that they are used to using in order to solve that problem. Now, his point is that when the Enlightenment occurred and liberal democracy came in, classical liberal, which is now conservative, and the Enlightenment point of view that democratic systems will work and all that kind of thing is not going to solve the problems we have now. And his frame of reference is the ecological question. You know, I was asked at the break about what about growth? What about our obsession with growth? And Tom and I have had a lot of conversations on that over the years, probably more than he wants to remember. And Ophuls says that if you impose our democratic way of thinking as it is now with the fascination for growth on a diminished environment, that is the limits to growth type thesis, which basically rose up in the 70s, it's a tragedy. You're not going to get there. And the article that I recall from him first was called Leviathan or Oblivion, and it would say, we need a benevolent dictator dictating that we will not despoil the environment, or we will do it, or we will be wrong ourselves. Now, I would apply that same logic to the question of can we get there with income policy and taxation? Yeah, we could, but the numbers that would really turn it around are so much out of anything that's being considered. See? We could impose all of Bernie's best wishes on the system. We'd be a little better off. I'm not sure we can fix it, if that makes sense.
Dave here. I was just curious, is it the capitalistic system that has gotten us to this point, or is there other dynamics taking place? Not that I understand economics at all. But
well, I'm not sure I understand it anymore. The only reason I pick on the term capitalism even is because there's lots of ways to describe it fundamentally, but it's the harnessing of self-interest. Okay, that's the way I like to think of it, and Obviously, Adam Smith's invisible hand says that you go out there and if you do right for yourself, you're automatically doing right for society as a whole. And we've kind of moved away from that, you know, I'm afraid. He didn't imagine multinational corporations and all of that kind of stuff. I may raise the name Karl Marx later. Yeah. Marx had it figured out a little better than Smith, although you have real problems. I do too, with Marx's solution to the problem. His analysis isn't bad.
Right here.
Yeah, okay.
It's Irene. You had in your presentation you talked about how you really can't get ahead unless you already have something. So in the past, our children, we all did start by buying a home, and we're noticing the younger children in our family are struggling with this very much. It may not be the best investment, but it certainly was something, a base. And we're seeing that most young people now can hardly afford rent, let alone buy a house. The rents are really, really high right here in Salem.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you had any comments on that. I know housing is a big deal in the whole economy.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I was in Portland Tuesday visiting our daughter in the home we bought for her. Right. And in a gentrifying neighborhood, which is hugely expensive. And her salary, and she couldn't afford to buy the home, of course, you know, a little divorce got in the way, but her salary is higher than anything I ever made. Yeah, and Tom and I retired at the same time. But, and I'm not saying, you know, we were careful, she's not. I'm saying it's impossible now to get to the point where we got, given the dynamics of that. I have, last year I co-taught a course at Portland State in the Graduate Urban Studies program on the Oregon land use planning system and urban growth boundaries. I fortunately got out of co-teaching it this year, but I've been up and been involved in it. And one of the presentations that I sat through just a few weeks ago was on Portland's housing market. It's just absolutely scary. Yeah, and Salem's no better in and of itself. Obviously, my wife, who some of you know, is knee-deep in the homelessness issue. And we'll talk about that later. Getting together a group to try and invest in low and moderate income housing in cooperation with the Housing Authority. Housing Authority here in Salem, the Section 8 housing, subsidized housing thing, we have plenty of money for vouchers for people to subsidize their rent. But the way the process works, they get the voucher approved, and then they go out and find a place to rent. They can't find a place to rent. They look for 6 months and come in and turn the vouchers back. So we're actually, you know, I don't want to just rely on federal dollars, but we're giving away the federal dollars because our housing market won't allow the kind of access that you need to access it. So yeah, housing is the big problem now. And incidentally, the Great Recession, the housing collapse, the values that disappeared in that collapse from previous homeowners, some of whom were fairly high, middle, lower income homeowners, by recent estimates about $7 trillion, 6 to 7 disappeared. Okay? Now, at first blush, that money disappears off the face of the planet. It's just values that don't exist anymore. It has rebounded back, but of course much of the gain in the rebound back has been with the companies that foreclosed. And there are examples of executives dropping out of Bank of America or Wells Fargo and knowing what's happening, forming little companies on the side, buying up all these distressed homes, which they can get quickly from their previous company. You know, they know how to pry them loose. Try to pry loose your own value from some of there. If you own the home, it's really tough. See, and then they buy them, rent them, hold them, and flip them, you know, build it up, and the flipping is a real problem now because you buy a rundown house, put a bunch of money in it, and then you can sell it for a lot more. You know, that kind of behavior on the housing channel is wonderful to watch, isn't it? And what that's done then is taken rundown neighborhoods, build them up, which on the surface looks like a good deal, but then you price out everyone else. And it's a really, the housing bubble collapse and the rebound from it has been an incredible contributor to more inequality in the system, because the money was taken away from homeowners, given to financial corporations. Okay.
Roger here, and you've mentioned a couple of times capitalism. It seems to me, as Adam Smith described it, the process was indeed that by doing something for society, you got more out of it. But one of my many concerns is my understanding that the top 10% to top 5%, perhaps especially the top 1%, find it much more lucrative to invest in instruments that are remote from actual production of anything. They're more of a bet on the stock market, and it makes me wonder if we're drifting away from a capitalist system entirely. If you have any comment about that, I'd be very interested in hearing.
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what I think is happening. In the book that my brother and I are just finishing, we note that an old view of an economy was the producing economy. Okay, everything around us. In the 70s, there was an idea built in called the primary economy was the natural resource base, the environment, if you will. And think about it, of course, if your environment is your resource base and it isn't healthy, your economy that relies on the resource base isn't healthy in the long run. So they invented the notion of, or developed the notion of the primary economy being a natural resource base, the secondary economy being what we think of as the economy, producing goods and services, and then the tertiary economy is the financial sector. The financial sector that you mentioned, and I remember I said 7% of our employment used to be there, now it's 40, okay? The financial sector has slowly taken over. It used to be in support of the secondary economy. That is, we finance your purchase of capital equipment so you can build things and we can grow and people can have goods and services and all those good things, you know. But the financial economy has become its own reason for being. And what you said is then, well, they now can create derivatives and create credit default swaps, and you have an options market, which doesn't mean anything. And then you can sell an option on the option and on the right to buy it. And I've taught investments for quite a few years, and it's almost impossible to understand how some of the derivatives and stuff are constructed, to where you can construct this cluster of financial instruments where you make money if the stock market goes up or down. Go figure. You know, well, the difference between the tertiary economy and the secondary is the secondary and primary are driven by supply considerations. If you run out of stuff, the market system adjusts. If you have more demand for stuff, you sell it. I mean, it's supply driven. The tertiary economy is demand driven, in that if there is a demand for that financial security, by George, we'll create it. See? And exactly what you said begins to happen is that you fool yourself that the economy really represents this trading of of claims on assets. See, that's all financial security is. In the old days, that's what it used to be, a claim on a physical asset. And now it's a claim on a claim on a claim that may be not a claim on a physical asset. See, the world GDP is in the 40 trillion range. In any day, there is more than that traded in financial securities around the world. See? And if you think about that, you know, and it boggles the mind to understand the theory behind all this. Believe me, I don't. And if you think about that, all that you can conclude is the economy that we've created is a very precarious thing, because you know the financial manipulation becomes its own reason for being. If the tax break goes to buying back stock, the tax break will directly cause more inequality. Because if you can get a tax break, you get cash, and many of the firms are announcing that's what they're going to do, at least in part with that money. And all that buying back stock does is it says we have fewer stockholders, just as much income. By George, that's going to cause stock price to go up. And the CEO is rewarded according to making stock price go up, period, anymore. There's virtually all the stock option stuff, the non-direct salary bonuses and perks that CEOs are given, CEOs and other top management probably. It's almost all based on price, because the shareholder is saying, well, you have a duty to maximize my price. That's your job. And frankly, that little feature is a pathological feature in our system. It's one we all accept. You know, oh yeah, a corporation has a duty of enhancing the wealth of its stockholders, and we all say, oh sure, that's fine. Well, we don't all own stock though. You know, 50% of the American population, it's the lowest 50, believe me, doesn't own any stock, and so I'm sorry to say it, but every uptick of the Dow Jones average is an increase in inequality. Yeah, I used to think the stock market's going up. That's good. I'm not so sure anymore. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. Sorry.
This is for now.
End of rant. End of this rant.
On a personal note,
Mm-hmm.
I've always been an optimist, and your talk is absolutely marvelous, but my hair about fell out. I would really appreciate it if you have something to fill my cup back up, because it was half full at the beginning.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I remember in environmental economics class, a student once a semester anyway would say, I'd be talking about destruction of the Amazon, or you know, acid rain polluting or something, and they'd say, how do you teach all this without getting totally depressed? You know, and I understand. That's what we're trying to do in the book, because the book's title is Localism, the Economics of Peace. Now the original title, which has been our working title for the last 25 years as we've been writing it, is my brother, you know. Our wives say, get that book out on the street. You will not spoil every family dinner from here on. Anyway, it started out as corporatism versus localism. So it's the difference. What we're talking about is the difference between assuming your economy that dictates your well-being in your community comes from the global system, or doing it yourself. See? And we found there are lots of ways. We recommend local manufacturing. We recommend starting with food and energy, manufacturing, local finance, starting a local bank or credit union, this kind of stuff. Now, this sounds like you're going back to the 19th century, see? But it doesn't work out that way at all. You have to read it. I'll give you a special price when it comes out. But where we conclude is that the global economy, as we've just been discussing, is fragile, and it could be challenged by energy shortages, for instance. My brother's first job here in Oregon back in the 70s was working on the Oregon energy study when Governor McCall was governor. And so he'd been into energy stuff his entire career. And I taught energy economics. I was on a committee that started the Oregon Department of Energy. So I've long been an aficionado of energy as the driving force in our economy. Energy shortages, and fracking isn't all it's cracked up to be, energy shortages and other resource shortages could propel us into a world where we need to rely on ourselves more than we used to. We may need to go that direction. We try to set out a positive image of what that could look like. Because let's face it, when you go into Walmart and buy a good, and you go to your job at somewhere else, there is no relationship in your mind between the stuff you consume and the stuff you produce, like a local economy would be. See, in Nolandia, they'd have to worry about that because they're a closed system. Well, the global economy has done the ultimate in disjointing what you produce and what you consume. Think about it for a second. If your shoes are made in China or Indonesia, where first Nike Michael Jordans were made in Indonesia, and the workforce is 50 cents an hour, almost all women, it would take them, and the shoes, a pair of shoes sold for 140 bucks. There's $5.60 worth of labor in the $140 final price. And where's that, the rest of that money going? Well, shipping and transportation, distribution, marketing, paying Michael Jordan for endorsement, all other corporations, largely. The workforce is minimized. I think it's a pathological feature for capitalism that we've evolved into a corporate mindset. It says, avoid labor costs. Now, think about it. If you can't afford to buy the product you're producing, and we are told you're too high priced to produce the product you're consuming, the international system's going to break down. Now, trade is supposed to lubricate that, and Tom and I can debate this one over a beer. Does trade help everybody anymore? The multinational corporation has injected itself into the middle of that transaction, which we go back to David Ricardo and the theory of comparative advantage, which says that trade helps, it augments the wage rate of the person who produced it in one country, and it lowers the price of the good to the consumer that consumes it in the other country. It changes hands at the border. One very important point that Ricardo made that is not remembered very often is that the goods must change hands at the border. In other words, at the border, when the goods pass through, there's a market transaction, a buyer and a seller. If you have, when we opened up China with the WTO and all that, American corporations would have said, did say, wow, there's 1.3 billion people there. What a market. When we get in there, we can sell all kinds of things to them. So the image was we can produce stuff here and sell it to China. Instead, the corporations go there, start up their branch plant. We're doing exactly the opposite. We're producing there and selling here. And that gain from trade that results when the market transaction at the border sells one good for another, that gain from trade disappears because the multinational corporation can capture some of the gain to the consumer by keeping prices up, and can capture some of the gain to the producer by keeping wages down. And that's what they're seeking, the low wage havens. Incidentally, they're now starting to flee China because its wages are a little high to go to Thailand or Burma or some other place like that. So anyway, think locally. And if in a local production system for your basic needs, we try to set up an example in the book. If you start a company to produce something, my wife's begging me not to use the example shoes, but I love it. Shoes, for instance. She doesn't want to criticize Nike, see. If you produce your own and the company is structured not to be a multinational, see, it only producing for this local market. You can take off of your income statement marketing, transportation, distribution, advertising, and you can end up paying your workers $20 an hour and underselling the Nike. See? So the image, well, that speaks to a fear that we have, that everybody would have, is that, well, it's fine to produce all our own stuff here locally, but it'd be so much higher priced. See? No, it doesn't have to be. Only if the company you start tries to be smart and become a multinational. And that's our image, isn't it? When you start a business, well, you got to get on the internet and do this, do that, and prepare. Well, you're just putting yourself in position to have to compete with very low wages elsewhere in the world. It's a recipe for failure. All right, sorry. End of rant. Next rant.
This is Charlene. I'm sort of tied into what Vernell is saying. As I've been sitting here, I am feeling like justice and equality are hopeless. And I need some hope.
Wow. Well, I taught a course with Lane McGahey, who many of you know. I think he's spoken here, in a seminar in American ethics, and he's in the religion department. Maybe that's where you need to look for hope. I'll try to set up our local economy. If you buy a shoe, though, that was produced in your own community, instead of buying an imported shoe, same price, assume. My urban and regional economic analysis, where I worry about multipliers and local value-added creation and all that, you automatically get a whole bunch more jobs because of the spending stays in your community. So we don't have to produce all our own goods. We just have to produce a few of our basic needs, and you pick up a net new jobs from each of them without spending any more money. And suddenly you have the ability to keep your own economy healthy. It insulates you from a recession as well. So I don't know if our final chapter is what would this look like as a political system. We'll see.
Hi, my name is Stephen. My question is, I've heard that the manufacturing in Germany, there's a ratio of like 5-to-1 between the administration and the workers.
Right. With workers required to be on the governing board, you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if that has that ever been looked into? I mean, that seems like a pretty good model they have, and they're very effective in manufacturing. I think there's maybe.
You people are moving me from chapter to chapter in my book. That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay. What you're asking is how could we? I'm going to rephrase and say, is this what you're? How could we restructure a firm so that it helps rather than hurts in terms of creating inequality? Well, another great question. Think about a corporation. The owners, when you're a single proprietorship, smallest possible corporation, the owner and the worker are the same. So you have no income distribution difference between the workers and the owners, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I told you we'd get to Marx eventually. As the firm grows and the owner essentially dissociates him or herself from being the worker, then there's a conflict developed. See? And the corporation has become the pituitary case of that conflict, where the whole goal of a corporation is seen as gathering profits by avoiding paying workers. See? Now, there are a couple or three other factors of production there, the interest, capital, and land. They're assumed to be pretty much have to pay whatever you have to pay to rent your land and pay a bank interest rate on capital, you know. But when a firm grows, the surplus that is created by that growth collects with owners, and that's the source of all our big concentrations of wealth, really. Now, we propose in the next chapter that you structure a firm at the local level so that the initial capital is put in with people like us who aren't really wealthy but have a little bit to invest, and we invest it as preferred stockholders, say maybe earning 6 or 8%. And how would you like to earn 8% relatively risk-free? Sounds pretty good these days, doesn't it? Okay, and then the surplus goes to higher wages, so that as the firm grows, the workers get more automatically. And you know, this is nothing more than a co-op or an ESOP or a worker-owned capitalism. But those kinds of things, co-ops, etc., have been seen as kind of niche, boutique things that couldn't possibly be the core of your main producing economy. And it's because of our fascination with bigness. You know, you have to have a big corporation, or you don't get anywhere. So I think the structure of a business firm at a local level would have to be organized so that it helps inequality rather than automatically hurting it. See?
They also we have a choice of whether to go into more academic training in school at a certain point.
Yeah, recognizing what your ideal workforce is going to be. Yeah, exactly. I can stay here all night, but
this is Ken.
You can't.
I have a question, and I bet there's not a chapter in your book on this.
Yeah, I'll bet you're right.
I just wonder where it's going to end. You know, even if all the Democrats get in and we win all the houses and we get the president, it seems unlikely that they can turn this around. And some of the most angry people, the biggest victims of this thing, are the best armed. You know, could it end in revolution, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, and you're right, there's no chapter there. But this gets us to the broad question. It's probably a good place to kind of finish, is the whole cultural impact of all of this. See? Let's suppose that a fairly radical restructuring of our politics and our economics is in order. Is it the only thing that's going to work? Can that happen democratically? And the education of the populace toward radicalism doesn't happen. See? And I think this is kind of what you're speaking to. And furthermore, all the wedge issues that create the strife you're talking about, guns and, you know, homophobia, whatever, all of that stuff has been used as a political tool for the last 35, 40 years. Yeah. Now, to really, maybe I'll step on people's toes. I don't care. I'm tenured, retired, and everything else. But my view of what has happened is, if you look at the economic agenda of the right wing 40 years ago, those people who were really irritated that Goldwater lost, see? If you look at their economic agenda, it's a highly, and it turned into the neoliberal bit, the Project for American Century and all that. It has no possibility of helping more than 10 to 15% of the population, okay? It's going to concentrate wealth and hurt everyone else. Well, somebody very smart knew that back then. And therefore we say, how are we going to get elected when our agenda hurts 90% of the people? You need 51% voting for you. How are you going to do this? Well, we're going to convince them that they shouldn't vote on anything other than anti-abortion rights, anything other than NRA, anything other, and pick a wedge issue. All right? Now, I went to the first National Energy Conference in 1976 back in Washington. And since I'm a Willamette student, I'm in the same fraternity, I knew Mark Hatfield, and I stopped in to say hello to him in 76. And I said, you know, we've got no energy policy. Jerry Ford was president, I think, then, and wondering what to do about anything. And I said to Mark, we have no energy policy nationally. And he said, oh, that's not true. We have 535 energy policies. Every senator and representative here has one. Then I said to him, how does it feel to be at the hub of power? And he said, I would remind you without missing a beat. He said, I would remind you the hub is the only part of the wheel that is not moving. So, that's good. But what he said recently, he said, getting elected these days is a matter of getting 17 interest groups to support you. I said, what? He said, data show that every interest group attracts about 3% of the voting population that won't vote any other way other than that interest group. If you can get 17% interest groups supporting you, 17 times 3 is 51%, and you get elected. Okay? So that answers your question, I think. Yeah. But you see, the poisonous now of our politics is that a lot of people had to be lied to get them online with all that for many years. And the whole Fox News phenomenon and all that is just part of that culturally, I think. There, I've said it, you know, somebody guns me down. So where are we? Okay.
Can I get my question? A new book. What about water?
Oh, well, I can't solve everything. I think water is as likely as oil to be the liquid that we go down on, really. You know, and little things like, when I used to teach environmental economics, I had a model that talks about how you shift the crisis around. You know, you run out of oil and you start using coal. Then, oh, whoops, you put pressure on coal. Coal puts pressure on water because of the way it's handled, and so on and so forth. And that the modern view of technology is merely to look around at all these systems and say, which one's most in crisis? Let's treat that one. But the treating of that one drives the crisis up a lot of other places. So I used to say rather cynically, so the perfect answer for technology is we run out of everything all at once. Okay? But to use a current example, we think fracking and shale oil and all that kind of stuff back in North Dakota and wherever has solved our energy problems. Well, those sources technologically are going to run out faster than oil wells ran out. So that, I don't know if any of you have ever been into the oil peaking theory, peak oil kind of thing. That's another lecture if you want. But the peaking of oil is gradual. That is, an oil well runs down kind of at a very predictable, slow rate. It's peaked in Saudi Arabia. We produced last year we exported more energy last year for the first time ever than Saudi Arabia. And a few years ago, Saudi Arabia used to have 15% water in the oil, and they have to dewater it to get it to export grade and all that. Now it's 55%. See, and that's just evidence that it's running out. Well, the fracking thing is putting incredible pressure on water in those very dry areas, but when it runs out, we will have a much more difficult time solving our energy crisis problems than had we solved it before we invented fracking. See? So anyway, I agree with you. Water is an ultimate crisis. We haven't faced it yet, but I don't think we're very far away at all from having to face it. I mean, look at the Central Valley in California. I mean, it's back to drought just because it didn't snow this winter. Well,
this is Lester. On a less global discussion.
Oh, good.
I was amazed to read one day that the economy was doing so well, and one of the indicator was an increase in credit card debt and personal long-term debt, which was figuring into our gross national product.
An
Any
increase,
comments about that?
an increase in that was supposed to be a good indicator.
Yeah, good indicator of our economy's health.
That probably goes back to the old consumer confidence thing. Now this is nothing more than the death throes of consumerism, right? I mean, we all know that 70% of our GDP is consumption. So a very superficial view of economic health is that if you get consumption up, your economy's healthier. You're just borrowing against the future even more, probably. I mean, yeah, we all need to consume, but I would reject that that's a superficial measure of health that doesn't make sense. I agree with you. I don't know what else to say about that. Scary.
Looks like we have just one more question.
All right.
Yeah, I'm Ken. Taking a longer term view, we all remember not too long ago when the Japanese were the big problem because their wages are low and they could turn things, out cheaply, and they got higher wages and things moved to China to oversimplify. And now the Chinese the one guy on top now, he has to give his people something because he's afraid of them. So could you say something a little about that long term?
An experience I've had that I absolutely accidentally got into since retiring, as I ended up teaching for 4 years in the MBA program at George Fox up till a couple of years ago. They have an MBA program there. They had it. They've kind of relaxed it because the money has dried up. But they had an MBA program there that was purposely half Chinese students. And I took the job out of kind of duress, but I was learning so much having half the class Chinese and half the class American, all graduates, business majors. I was learning so much from the Chinese. I did it for 4 years until I find. The Chinese economy, I'm getting to the Japanese bit here in a minute, that we're 70% of our GDP is consumption. And then maybe 15% government, maybe 15% business spending, investment spending. The Chinese economy is 36% consumption. Okay? Now, what that means, if their circular flow is to be kept in balance, they have to have a whole lot more business spending to make up the difference. Now, what that means is, that's why the Chinese economy now is viewed on the rocks, in a macro sense, when its growth rate has dropped to 6 or 7. And we would die for 6 or 7. Believe me, we would die if we had it too. Because the environment couldn't support it. Well, anyway, an economy matures that becomes a consumption economy, and that's basically what Japan did. It went through what the British Empire did back in 100 plus years ago, only it did it very fast, faster than the decline of the British Empire. And the Japanese economy has struggled in the last 20 years. We know that. It's because it's tried to become a mature economy where you really import more than you export. So it's the movement from an exporting to an importing kind of thing. That movement has affected the United States very well too, because I challenged my fellow economists who would say, oh, American capitalism was at its peak back in the 50s, back in post-war era, because the middle class was thriving. It was thriving because we were the only unwrecked economy coming out of World War II. So we were a big exporting nation, and it was thriving because the dollar was the international currency. It still is. If you want a crisis looking ahead, just read a little bit about what would happen when the dollar becomes not the world currency. And there are movements afoot to do that. I mean, to go that route. Lo and behold, we could never afford to have military applications in every country in the world. But the movement of the dollar off of world currency would have really dire implications for the U.S. economy.
As you said, that's
a little bit like what Japan went through, but they're just kind of struggling along as a mature economy, trying to worry about imports, exports not balancing anymore. Yeah.
well, and then there's the rest of the story, but we've run out of time to hear that. So thank you so much.